Well, hello everybody. I think you all know who I am, Jim Waits with Radio Relay International. Today we're going to be covering emergency communications planning. This course was actually originally developed as a training course for the Michigan State Police Emergency Management Division, and the primary audience was, law enforcement and to some extent fire service and emergency management and so forth. And what we've kind of done with the course is we've taken the fundamental concepts and we've adapted them to make it a little more amateur radio specific. But there's a lot of useful information in here that would be helpful really to anybody that's involved in emergency services or emergency planning, because it's theoretical in concept in many respects. And that is, how do we plan for a disaster telecommunications problem of some type. So hopefully you'll get some good information out of it. And again, there's a lot of nuance to what actually happens in a disaster. So the idea here is to get you thinking about the processes that you can implement to be better prepared in time of emergency. So I'm going to share my screen, and I will bring up the program, and we will get started. So again, I just want to thank everybody for being here. Again, this is Radio Relay International Class TR-006, Emergency Communications Planning. So, obviously most of you have an association with RRI. If you don't, the philosophy of RRI has been the concept that we support two types of emergency response. The most obvious one that we think of when we talk about amateur radio, EMCOM, at least here in North America anyway, is the concept of organizational response, right? So we have a wide variety of local and state EMCOM groups or organizations. Obviously, the ARRI's Amateur Radio Emergency Services Program, the RACES program, both of which kind of originate in the 1940s and 50s, and of course in more recent years, OXCOM and things of that nature. So while RRI is not in the local EMCOM business, we are in the training business, and we are in the business of providing infrastructure. And of course, our infrastructure is open and it's available to organizations. It's also available and open to individual responders. So this would be the radio amateur who has found himself in a situation perhaps where he is the communications resource for his community, a small volunteer organization active in disaster response, or for example, my guess is that if you were a radio amateur in the Asheville area in the, say, 72 hours or longer, maybe the first week surrounding much of that devastation, an individual radio amateur could provide some very useful services, both within an organization or without. You just happen to be the guy that's got the radio equipment, the skills, and the access to network infrastructure, be it RRI or WinLink or NTS or whatever the case might be. Regardless of which organization we support, access to RRI networks is based on the concept of message prioritization. So it is the priority of the messages being injected into the traffic system that determines access, right? So for example, emergency or priority, or welfare messages, or fast telegram routine messages, generally in order of response. So let's talk a little bit about some of the fundamentals of emergency communications and how that kind of fits into this organizational concept. So first of all, there's generally four vital characteristics that are considered in emergency communications planning. And these are, of course, survivability, flexibility, circuit capacity, and communication security. And the reality is that, at least for radio amateurs, we are let's call it the communications or radio service of last resort. Generally speaking, if you're in the fire service or you're in law enforcement and your two-way radio system is working, Amateur radio is probably not your primary go-to resource. You may utilize amateurs for some value-added services, supplemental services, but generally speaking, in those situations, you will find that the radio amateur is a volunteer who happens to bring his own radio and radio infrastructure with him. But if you actually have to rely on the amateur radio service to replace or fill in holes in a government or commercial telecommunications infrastructure, you need a survivable resource, right? Because we're kind of the last resort. And you've all heard the expression, when all else fails, right? So people found out that when all else fails, amateur radio is one of the survivable resources, along with some other things like, Starlink and so forth. But therefore, you might argue that our first and foremost responsibility is survivability, right? So amateur radio is survivable for a number of reasons, one of which obviously is the fact that we are decentralized. So again, as a broad rule, there are two ways that you can achieve survivability, one of which is redundancy, say as in the case of the internet or the telecommunications companies, alternate circuits, automatic switching, things of this nature. You have lots of circuits available, you have lots of paths available, and therefore you have redundancy. Another method is decentralization. So if we decentralize or disperse our assets, and we're not relying, say, on choke points such as key or critical nodes, or mobile switching offices, or central offices, or a fiber optic cable, etc., we can obviously be decentralized and dispersed. And this is another way to achieve redundancy and survivability. So amateur radio really achieves its value, or derives its value, as a survivable communications method because of this decentralization and the lack of reliance on choke points within infrastructure. So again, let's use North Carolina and Hurricane Helene as an example. There's a lot of fiber optic cables that run along bridges. They run along roadways. They run along railroad infrastructure. When you have a massive flooding situation where bridges are destroyed and roads are washed out and so forth, in many cases, the telecommunications infrastructure goes with that, right? So amateur radio doesn't have that problem because we can use high frequency radio, we can use VHF or UHF simplex, or ideally, maybe we have some repeaters that are still operational. The point I really want to make here is that the first and foremost responsibility, therefore, of amateur radio is to have in place your survivable modes. And the reason for that is the survivable modes, again, based on message prioritization, can be used to convey, number one, the highest priorities of traffic, but they can also facilitate the restoration of networks that perhaps have greater flexibility or circuit capacity. For example, there was a tornado in Detroit, I think in 1993 or 97, I don't remember which, but I was responsible for the telecommunications response, and we used amateur radio to coordinate the installation of additional, let's call it public switch telephone network infrastructure. We built an EOC from scratch in a large union hall in downtown Detroit, Michigan. And we also built up 3 service centers for FEMA and Red Cross and so forth in the area. And all of that required pulling, lots of cable and dispersing telecommunications circuits. Meanwhile, we had other locations located a good 90 to 100 miles away. We were able to coordinate that process via amateur radio. And we used amateur radio primarily as a tool for just, basic, necessary communications and coordinating the restoration of survivable, regular commercial telecommunications infrastructure to get these service centers operational. So there's a lot of things you could talk about in this program. I should probably keep on track with the time schedule, but again, survivability comes first. Then comes the issue of flexibility. Simply put, a communications system or capability is of little value unless it can be deployed to where it's needed, right? So, for example, you might have the capacity to, on a data network, to transmit, an encyclopedia every 30 seconds or minute, but it doesn't do you much good if you can't do it from where it's needed. The incident command post, the fire station, the police station, your local community center, whatever the case might be. So again, flexibility is next in order of importance. So survivability first, then next comes flexibility. That is the ability to deploy communications to where it's needed. And of course, amateur radio, one of its blessings is that it has so much flexibility. For example, I often counsel ARES groups not to deploy new digital voice modes and the like on VHF because we have other VHF and UHF bands available. One of the beauties of ham radio is I can take a 2-meter FM handheld transceiver, get on an airplane, and I can fly to Los Angeles, California, and I can instantly access an MCOM net in a disaster area. You can't do that with, say, an APCO 25 handheld radio. It has to be properly programmed, whitelisted on the network and all these other factors in order for that to happen. Same thing with HF radio. I can go anywhere pretty much in the world and establish communications via HF radio using common denominator modes, or even some more advanced modes like WinLink. So the idea here is that flexibility is, again, an advantage of ham radio, and it's really the second most important capability or area of concern in disaster response. Then we talk about circuit capacity, and people occasionally call circuit capacity bandwidth. They use the terms interchangeably. It's kind of a misnomer. Circuit capacity is essentially the amount of communications traffic that can be handled on a circuit in a given period of time. Historically, things like words per minute for telegraph and teletype or baud rate, or in the old phone company, calls in progress, things of that nature. The circuit capacity is important sometimes, but in reality, again, if the network's not survivable and it's not flexible, circuit capacity is not really that important, right? Because it doesn't do you any good to be able to handle lots of communications traffic if you can't deploy it to where it's needed. Again, think of that in terms of the technical side. I also want to point out that large quantities of message traffic can be detrimental to the rather slow human decision-making process. So, for example, if you look at the human brain, it functions in much the same manner as it probably did when a Roman general crossed the Rubicon and the die was cast. A human being can only read so much. He can only handle so much input. If you look at the way an EOC or an incident command post operates, there's lots of information coming in, and rarely does one guy make a decision in a vacuum. What happens is you get a piece of information, be it a message. You have to read and understand the message. You have to place it in a temporal context. That is, you have to understand where it fits in the timeline. You have to maybe do a little bit of research in order before you can act on that message. You may even need to discuss that message with your colleagues, right? And this takes time. And so it's nice if you can send a lot of message traffic to, say, an EOC, but the problem often amounts to is once it gets past the message router, the human decision-making process is actually rather slow. And so there's kind of a two-sided coin with lots of circuit capacity. If you have the ability to defer your problems up the chain of command, as somebody might in the field, it's tempting not to take responsibility for difficult decisions because you can simply transmit messages, emails, whatever to your your superiors, and you can leave the problem to them. The problem is people have a limited span of control. So circuit capacity is valuable. Its real benefit is the ability to send a spreadsheet, photographs, bulk data for research or accounting purposes, or the old phrase, "A picture's worth 1,000 words," right? So there are advantages to circuit capacity, but put it in its proper perspective, it's not quite as important as flexibility or survivability. So again, remember the human interface issue, understand the real value, which is obviously, you have, record a record of all the communications traffic if it's a data circuit, and people can, obviously you can send binary files, right? But understand the relationship between the two. In my opinion, at least for the amateur radio service, and we're not talking about national security issues here, the security is our least concern. We're generally not operating in a national security environment. We usually have enough diversity of modes and networks that the uninitiated are not going to be able to track them down easily, even with the internet. For example, if you have a section CW traffic net, somebody could probably look up that frequency. Maybe they could tune it in, but they would have a difficult time following the network procedures and process. Most media outlets don't have a single sideband capable receiver in their newsroom where they can tune in a high frequency network. If you want to handle maybe some information that's a little bit sensitive and you put it on a mode like VHF single sideband on a point-to-point circuit, the local scanner enthusiast is not likely to be able to decode 2-meter single sideband or whatever the case might be. But generally speaking, most of the communications traffic we handle is not going to be security sensitive. You would get into organizations like Mars and the like, that's a different animal. You're not operating on amateur frequencies. There's generally two ways to obtain security, encoding and encryption. Encryption is prohibited on the amateur radio service. We do encode traffic sometimes, but it's encoded in such a way that it's really, it's a way of, it's universal encoding, right? Q signals and things of this nature for efficiency's sake, certain abbreviations and the like. We can, however, attain what you might call inherent security, right? Which we kind of talked about through frequency management, mode specialization, the use of digital modes, etc. There's inherent security in all of those things, all of which is legal, and all of which is going to kind of protect your communications from the media and other people who might create problems associated with it. So again, there's inherent security, there's design security. Amateur radio offers some inherent security, but it's really not all that important. I was getting a chuckle, by the way, out of this graphic. It looks like Joseph Stalin copying a number station, but I don't think he was a CW operator. Anyway, so this is a little tool that I developed to kind of illustrate the concept. Survivability is the foundation of emergency communications. And then atop of that, in order of importance, we build flexibility, circuit capacity, and in those rare circumstances, if it's necessary, security. And that's kind of the order of importance. So once you understand that concept, we want to talk a bit about communications traffic, right? So as a general rule, there's three types of communications traffic, and this is the tactical communications. So let's say, for example, you have American Red Cross operating in a disaster situation, and they have these emergency response vehicles and these canteen trucks, and perhaps you're coordinating the movement of those throughout the disaster area, and there's an amateur radio operator embedded in each of these vehicles. Well, you might give them instructions such as, IRV 22, please transport 15 cots to, Harding Middle School. Uh, and of course, that's a simple, Roger, or Wilco response kind of thing. And it's very tactical in nature. You don't need to log it. You don't need to transcribe it as a message. It's pretty much, hey, you go there, do this, please. Or, what's your ETA at such and such a location? That's tactical communications. Then we have record message traffic, and this is generally the message traffic that we transmit on behalf of third parties. So this would be things like, ICS 213 messages, radiograms, things of that nature, where I transmit a message on behalf of, for example, a served agency official, and I transmit it, I inject it into a radio circuit, comes out the other end, somebody transcribes the message or prints it, if it's a digital network, and he takes that printed message and hands it to a served agency official to whom it's addressed, or perhaps it goes to a message router and he deals with it, like in a message center or EOC environment. So we have tactical communications, we have record message traffic, and then of course we have specialized modes, for example, APRS or amateur television, or some of these deployable Wi-Fi mesh networks that are being developed in some more urban, more concentrated areas. These will kind of classify as specialized modes. So we're going to talk a little bit and dig into this, this concept of tactical versus record message traffic a little bit more as we proceed through this. But again, to understand kind of the communications process, we should also recognize the fact that we have generally two types of MCOM response. We have the infrastructure functions, and then we have the last mile function. So generally, again, examples of infrastructure functions are things like the RRI, digital traffic network, or your traffic nets, your WinLink. WinLink, for example, is an infrastructure provider, right? They're essentially providing access points to the internet or to their infrastructure. Same with RRI. We are an infrastructure provider. You can put a message in at one end, and it comes out at the other end from which it's delivered or transferred to what we commonly call the last mile. So the last mile function you might think of as the final point. When a message reaches the final point of contact, then of course the message is delivered as appropriately and as quickly and accurately as possible. So, for example, served agency interface, right? It might be, you might be operating from a fire station, and you receive the message traffic, and you're responsible for getting it to the addressee, or in an EOC. Last mile functions might be local nets, right? Point-to-point circuits between a couple of hospitals in your county. The process from which a message goes from, say, the local network to the infrastructure, that's our last mile. So our Aries net has a liaison to WinLink, or it has a liaison to RRI. That's the last mile function. One of the things I would like to stress here too, and this is something often overlooked by radio amateurs, is that, let's say, for example, I'm 200 miles away and I send a message to a served agency official, and it arrives at the EOC, and that served agency official isn't in the EOC. I may not know where he is. He might be in transit between two different locations. He might be dealing with some issue, 5 miles away. That message may have been transmitted digitally, but when it reaches the point of interface to the last mile, the way of accessing that official might be over, say, a talk group on the local trunked public safety radio system. Somebody may have to take that message and say, I have a message for you from the Department of Public Health and at the state capitol. It reads as follows. If you transmit a message that's 500 words because you have digital available, but it turns out that when it reaches the last mile, it has to be delivered by telephone or a different radio service or whatever the case might be, that 500 words can become a disadvantage, right? So this is something to always think about. You'll hear me later in this program, and you'll often hear me say this: brevity is not just the soul of wit, but brevity is the soul of emergency communications. The other thing too is, if, for example, you look at the traffic network, what happens when a message moves from, say, the digital traffic network to a CW net, or a single sideband net, or a 2-meter FM net of some type, right? Large messages are inherently problematic. They're also, again, problematic from that human brain processor issue that we talked about earlier. It's nice that you can give a guy a 500-word message, but maybe if we boil it down to the 50 essential words, he can read it a lot faster. He gets to the meat of the data a lot faster, and he can process it and discuss it and share it with others verbally in a much faster way. So brevity is important in that last mile to facilitate that last mile interoperability between radio services and modes of delivery and so forth. So considering all of this, right, you will be wanting to, you want to think about these things when you engage in what's called mode selection. So you might think of an ARRL emergency coordinator or a COML or any of these kinds of guys that deal with amateur radio MCOM groups as an emergency communications resource manager, right? So if we look at your and again, I know we have at least one person or maybe two that are from outside the United States, but within North America, Canada, the United States, most counties have an emergency management director, and his job is to engage in emergency planning and facilitate emergency response. But you'll learn something interesting from these guys. They really have no authority. An emergency management director can't order the police chief around. He can't order around one of the city fire chiefs or police chiefs. He's really he's subordinate to elected political officials. His sole success is built on, number one, human relationships, but his actual functional aspects of his job, the success of the functional aspects, is predicated on his ability to support those various agencies by providing the resources that they need. Okay, so he's really an emergency resource manager or coordinator. He's not really he really doesn't have any authority beyond that. So the same kind of true when you're in charge of an amateur radio MCOM group. You have a duty to make responsible emergency communications and resource management decisions. This means dispensing with mode parochialism. You'll run into these groups that are what I call very mode parochial. They everything is built around WinLink. Everything is built around 2-meter voice nets. All their communications traffic occurs on a single net. They make decisions that are kind of based on either inadequate experience or information, and they don't really think about how to manage the resources they have efficiently to support an emergency, the various emergency management functions. So again, looking at your emergency action guidelines or your county emergency plan, you'll find the emergency plan is divided into what's called emergency management functions. So you'll see a section for fire service, a section for DPW, Department of Public Works. You'll see a section for law enforcement. You'll see a section for public health, so on and so forth. Well, in a way, that's one of the ways in which you look at how your amateur radio group might support local emergency services by emergency management function. So for example, you might use a VHF FM repeater for things like weather spotting or coordinating relief agency vehicle movements. You might use a repeater and handheld radios for supporting search and rescue functions. Maybe you'll integrate it through the neighborhood ham watch program where you have interfaces to GMRS and FRS to support SAR teams operating in neighborhoods. You might use data communications to link a couple of nearby EOCs or to link hospitals together. You might want to use UHF in a dense urban area because it offers better building penetration. You might use HFCW nets, particularly for medium or long haul communications, because they tend to be a bit more efficient, at least in the hands of good operators, than voice nets, and they're of greater value during poor propagation conditions. So again, mode selection based on survivability, flexibility, circuit capacity, and security, and mode selection based on the type of communications traffic the emergency management function requires, right? So, tactical communications is much different than record message traffic communications, and some emergency management functions require just basic tactical communications. Others will require record message traffic communications. So again, mode selection based on this kind of concept. And again, every mode has both advantages and disadvantages. So to illustrate this, let's take a look at some typical modes. We'll start with CW because it's the oldest, right? Radio telegraphy dates back to Marconi. Now the interface technology changes. We still have CW operators, but they use probably software-defined radios like the IC 7300s and the like, and better receivers, better frequency stability, et cetera, than you did 50 years ago. But CW is, as I jokingly call it, the cockroach of emergency communications. It's simple, it's reliable, it's got relatively narrow bandwidth. It's ideal for if you want to deploy an HF transceiver out of doors somewhere into a disaster area. All you need is a key, a battery, a small transceiver, and a wire. Okay, and generally speaking, and we've actually proven this in both internal disaster exercises as well as the federal exercises where amateur radio has been deployed, that the CW nets are about 2 to 3 times more efficient than single sideband nets, and there's reasons for that. It's we won't go too deep into it, but there are reasons for that. And of course, it's a universal common denominator. You can walk into any amateur radio station in the world, and it's capable of CW, right? And it's also ideal for low power. So I did a whitewater rafting trip down the Grand Canyon with friends back in 2017, and I put a FT817 and basically a complete QRP rig in one of these 50 caliber ammo cans, and it survived the trip just fine, lashed to a raft, and it was great. You can throw a wire up in a tree for NVIS and communicate out of the Grand Canyon. There's not much else that works. Even sat phones are kind of problematic, although I'd recommend carrying one if you're by yourself. But for a communications capability, it's pretty handy. So again, simple. All you need is a key, a small transceiver, a battery, maybe a little solar panel, and you can operate indefinitely. I mentioned federal exercises during the Cascadia Rising federal exercise in 2016. CW networks scored a 99.998% accuracy rate against 5-letter cipher group messages, and that's across over more than 13,000 data points. So it actually scored superior accuracy. Second of all, the message propagation time through the infrastructure networks, that is the time measured from when a message was drafted in the disaster area on the Pacific Northwest, that was Alaska, Washington State, Oregon, Idaho, or Northern California, from the time at which that message was drafted and tendered for origination by the radio operator to the time it appeared in the data stream at the National Response Coordination Center in Washington, D.C., measured in the average range of 10 to 15 minutes. Okay. It also proved far superior to propagation anomalies than the backdoor networks that were utilized as a parallel cross comparison. So, again, I asked the rhetorical question, is CW obsolete? Well, you be the judge, right? Same thing during the Y2K rollover. During the Y2K rollover, I developed contingency plans for the Michigan Department of Corrections and also the Michigan State Police Emergency Management Division. We linked state police posts, prisons, prison camps throughout Michigan to the state EOC using a variety of modes, everything from fax to public safety network to amateur radio. And part of the process was that hourly update reports were required from each of these facilities. And ironically, the CW net cleared traffic over the voice net at a rate of 3.75 to 1. It also cleared traffic over a VHF packet network that served primarily southeastern lower Michigan by a rate of 4 to 1. And ironically, this was despite the fact that I had to take the CW positions antenna away, nice big outdoor antenna, and I had to hook up a Manpack transceiver so a Maritech National Security Division could talk to FEMA on 5 and 10 megahertz. And so we built an improvised through the glass antenna coupler using aluminum foil and tape. How I got the nickname MacGyver at the state police headquarters. But we built it through the glass coupler, and we took a 20-watt SG 2020, and that became the antenna, this piece of wire thrown up in a tree on the other side of that through the glass coupler. And yet the CW station outperformed the HF single sideband position with full-size antenna and 100 watts. Now, I'm not making these examples to say you should be doing CW. And again, it's not a mode parochial kind of thing. The point is that you shouldn't make assumptions about networks. And you should understand that all modes have advantages and disadvantages, right? And which makes them either a better choice or a lesser choice for what you're trying to accomplish, okay? Voice methods. I mean, voice is a great mode because it's universal. Basically any radio transceiver manufactured probably in the post-war era, at least 1960s onward, is capable of single sideband communications. We generally still have a fairly universal FM repeater infrastructure. And of course, basic radio telephone skills are pretty easily developed. They're a lot easier to develop than CW skills, for example. But there are disadvantages. First and foremost, because voice nets are so accessible, you will find that nets often get gummed up with, let's call it wannabes. Okay, so you're collecting weather data from the Gulf Coast during a hurricane, and the guy checks in from North Dakota to let net control know, well, I'm here if I'm needed. Well, the odds that an operator in North Dakota is going to be required is pretty low, and all you're doing is burning up circuit capacity and distracting people from the important traffic on the net. The other problem is that inexperienced operators usually don't know how to handle traffic. They don't know how to properly transfer record message traffic so that it's accurate, is transmitted in a timely fashion, and you make maximum use of the limited circuit capacity. So they make all kinds of errors in the message traffic. There's all kinds of repeats because they didn't want to learn how to handle traffic because they thought, well, handling some radiograms, once a month or once every couple of months is silly. I can send an email. Yeah, that's true. You can send an email, but how do you learn how to transmit a message accurately on behalf of a third party if you don't practice, right? It's just like shooting sports or skiing or playing the piano. You have to practice, right? Yeah, fly fishing, whatever the case might be. You have to practice. And what happens with the voice nets is you'll find people want to help, and it's honorable, and it's very nice that they do, but they've done nothing to prepare to operate efficiently on the nets in time of emergency. And then, of course, we talked about balkanization on 2 meters. The fact that now you have a lot of Aries groups, they want to go digital voice, or there's a repeater in the Chicago area. I don't know if it's still up and running, but they were set up on APCO 25. How many hams use APCO 25 on 2 meters? Kind of silly in a way. In recent years, digital methods have been very common, and I'm a big proponent of digital. Obviously, RRI has a fairly extensive digital traffic network. We have a interface between WinLink and RRI. The beauty of digital modes is that they're error correcting and they're automated, right? So they take out a lot of the net overhead, the human the human element in the relay and transmission of messages. But I do want to caution anybody that watches this or listens to it that yes, it's an automatic error correcting mode such as PACT or Vera. The problem is that the error usually occurs at the human interface, the guy typing in the message, right? So typos. Now this is kind of ironic because during that Cascadia Rising exercise, the accuracy rate for the digital side was slightly less. It's de minimis really, but it was 99.997. So that was still, basically almost perfect accuracy. But there were a few errors that were obviously typos in that 5-letter cipher group traffic, those random messages, and also there was some. There were also fewer data points for the digital communications. I think there were, maybe 7 or 8,000. I don't know. I'd have to look it up. But again, the other problem with digital, if you want to call it a problem, a potential limitation, is you need an interface device, right? You need a tablet, you need a laptop, you need a computer. There's cables involved. Sometimes there's sound cards, modems. You have to power these additional things. Maybe out in the field, if you're at an incident command post in the rain, you might not want to have these things getting wet, whereas with a just basic voice transceiver or the like, you can wrap it up in a baggie and keep it reasonably dry. The other problem with digital is that in the operational environment, your served agency official is not going to be wanting to run up to look at your screen every time a message comes in. It helps a lot if you can print messages for the addressee. Now, some cases you can send like an EOC, you can send them to a digital message router. But the fact is, if you're out in the field or you're at an incident command post, having a printer is pretty handy because then your runner can just take a message to whomever the local officials are. However, printers don't work good in damp, cold, miserable environments. So again, digital's not always the best choice. Again, as mentioned earlier, things like point-to-point circuits, if you need to transmit binary files, if you have a nice mobile command post or EOC, they're great. From home, they're great. They're maybe even okay in the field, but always remember that situations will arise where it's not practical to deliver messages verbally or have people run over to look at a computer screen or the like. Which brings me to another point, and that is having the basic skills is helpful. The ability to transcribe a message by hand, the ability to use a basic message form. Now, pencils never fail. Paper doesn't give you the blue screen of death. There's no power needed for a write and read notebook and a pencil. There are just some situations where, a waterproof notebook and a good pencil or two, or some carbon copy message forms is just the tool of choice. It's the weapon of choice. It's again, think about these things. There's no one size fits all. There's no one rule. But again, both as an individual participant and if you're a leadership official of some kind, like an EC or somebody in charge of an Oxcom group, you are going to be making resource management decisions. You need to think about how things are going to work in the field. So allow me to take a sip of drink here. It's my sore throat. So let's talk about the broader picture of emergency planning for local MCOM groups. And we will dig through this. So all emergency planning, and this goes for government planning, not just, HAMs. All emergency planning starts with hazard and vulnerability analysis. So obviously, you first have to identify the hazards in your area. And, this is largely geographical, right? It's based on where you live. If you look at, for example, Southern California, the Pacific regions, earthquakes are a potential hazard, maybe volcanoes in the northwestern United States. So you have geological threats, potential for tsunamis, and so forth. And in the upper Midwest, maybe widespread ice storms. For example, some years back, it might be 20 years ago now, don't quote me on it, but there was a massive ice storm that impacted eastern Canada, and I believe it resulted in the greatest mobilization of the Canadian forces since World War II. And there were weeks and weeks that a lot of areas had no electricity. Well, that's what you would again call a weather-related disaster. Most of this we know intuitively, right? What are the hazards in my area? We kind of know, but sometimes we don't. So for example, what kind of hazardous materials are located in the area? What might result in widespread evacuation? What could result in a significant explosion? So the emergency manager will look at these hazards, and then he will, having identified the hazards, he's going to look at the vulnerabilities, and he's going to look at ways that he can manage the vulnerabilities. So my guess is, for example, in North Carolina, people probably knew flooding was a hazard, but my guess is they may have underestimated the vulnerability to flooding. Okay, and then that's the other side. So you have your hazards, and then you have your vulnerabilities. Radio amateurs should look at this too. And you can usually go to your emergency management director or even your state EMA. Many of them will publish a hazard and vulnerability analysis based on historical data and geotechnical studies of various kinds, and they will tell you what some of these risks and hazards are. You would be surprised how many central offices are located adjacent or within close proximity to the Pacific coast, and the potential exists for damage or destruction from tsunamis, things of that nature. So again, you need to kind of look at what your hazards are. You need to ask yourself how those hazards might disrupt not just general telecommunications infrastructure, but the amateur radio communications infrastructure. Okay, and so keep that in mind. I'm sure many here have heard of the emergency management cycle. So this is a concept that describes the process of emergency planning, you might say. So all emergency management starts with the concept of mitigation. So mitigation is lessening the impacts of disaster through engineering, construction, zoning, and similar types of issues. So a flood levee is a mitigation step. Installing hurricane straps on trusses in new construction in, say, Florida or Louisiana, or an area prone to hurricanes or typhoons, that's a mitigation step. These are things that essentially, minimize the impact of a hazard or vulnerability on a community. Within the framework of telecommunications, mitigation usually involves hardening, installing lightning and surge protection, maybe having redundant capabilities, having spare parts on hand for both communications equipment and antennas, having standby power available, be it battery backup or generators. Making sure towers are properly maintained and engineered to appropriate standards to withstand things like high winds, radial ice, general good engineering practice. You can apply mitigation both in your home, with your local club repeaters, and at your EOC, right? Good engineering practice is usually what it boils down to in the telecommunications sector. Again, as mitigation steps are being completed, ideally, the next step in the emergency management cycle is preparedness. And in the government world, this means stockpiling supplies, auditing and defining shelter facilities, training responders in emergency response, etc. Well, the same rules apply to us, right? We want to make sure that we have our survivable capabilities first, followed by our flexible capabilities, and we want to maybe have some advanced specialization available, even if it's through mutual aid with surrounding counties. You also have to make sure your people are properly trained to function efficiently on a voice circuit, to be able to handle traffic accurately and efficiently and in a speedy manner. You need to run some drills to make sure they can actually do it. That's the preparedness phase. Obviously, we know what response is, right? So that's when we actually, let's call it the flag goes up, and you have to support an emergency response in your community. And this is where you obviously have hopefully kind of planned, and you kind of already know which modes you want to use to support which emergency management functions, which facilities you might be asked to staff. You might need to have mutual aid with surrounding counties and your communities to bring in additional ham radio operators so you can work in shifts and deal with volunteer loss when individuals are directly impacted by disasters, etc. And you want to use all of these resources very efficiently, right? So you want to use methods that can integrate force multipliers. So here's a good example. Again, look at a search and rescue team. In the 1970s, if you put a search and rescue team out in the field, there would probably be one ham for every search and rescue volunteer. Not very realistic in this day and age, where you probably have less actually active hams involved in MCOM. But nowadays, if you say have a small search and rescue team that's operating in a neighborhood, say where everybody's within a half mile of each other, a couple of handheld FRS radios or GMRS radios is all that's necessary to communicate with a nearby ham radio gateway, maybe in his car, or that's embedded with this SAR group. So the SAR communicates with FRS or GMRS handheld radios, and then there's just one gateway, one ham that can communicate with the team, with the SAR team on FRS or GMRS. But he can be the gateway to this EOC, the public safety answering point that is the 911 center, to WinLink, to RRI, to whatever the case might be. So look at how you can utilize and develop those force multipliers. So the response obviously can be very dynamic. You'll have to improvise, adapt, overcome. But ultimately, if you got a good group of guys and they're properly trained in the basics, hams are pretty resourceful people, and they'll do it. Lastly is recovery. After you have an operation, you gotta sit everybody down and do what some people call the hot wash. What worked, what didn't, what kind of problems did we have? Do we need to implement additional training or better training? Do we need to improve the hardening of maybe a key infrastructure point like a repeater or whatever? Look at what went wrong, look at what can be improved, and then recovery should kind of evolve into mitigation, where you take what you learned and you use it to mitigate the impact of disaster on your infrastructure based on what you learned in the response. So it's a continuous cycle: mitigation, preparedness, response, recovery, back into mitigation. And that's the process, and it applies to hams in the same way that it does as it does in amateur radio, or in the professional world, let's call it that. Let's talk about some of the tools you can use to better prepare. Uh, Obviously, one of the tools that you can use to talk about mitigation and preparedness is what's called the tabletop exercise. I consider the tabletop exercise to be the best bang for the buck in the world of emergency planning. Uh, Basically, all a tabletop exercise is you get a group of responders or officials together, or in this case, a group of hams, and using your knowledge of hazards and vulnerabilities in the area, you present a realistic scenario of a disaster that might occur and what some of the impacts of the disaster might be. There's no timeline, there's no simulated messages. There's simply a moderator who presents a scenario, and as the scenario evolves, he asks the participants to work together to solve the problem. And as they work on that problem, he periodically injects new issues, new concerns, new problems that might emerge in a disaster. The idea, again, as these problems are injected, participants have to synthesize their solutions. So, for example, you might consider the direct impact of a disaster on organizational capabilities. So I might say, okay, we've had a major hurricane, and we have 100 active ARES members. Uh, our first problem is that I've been informed that we only have 33 members available. How do I manage those 33 members? A good 60% of them have critical jobs. They're linemen. They work for the power company. They work for the phone company. They're medical doctors. They're, et cetera. They can't respond because they've been called up for their job. So we've lost, 60% of our people. And I also can't work them 24 hours a day. So where are we going to get additional people? That would be a scenario that you could present, right? Let's say, for example, we've just had a hurricane and we've lost our primary repeater, and the other one's operating on backup batteries, and it can maybe run for 24 hours. How do we manage this problem? You can go into all of these potential scenarios and encourage people to discuss and synthesize solutions. Look at options. Look at, okay, this network's not going to work. What if we use this one? This allows you to kind of think about how you would respond and what mitigation steps you might want to take, what planning and training steps you want to take, right? So conduct the tabletop exercise. Look at mitigation. That's kind of your first step. And again, I won't dig into all of this, but I'll tell you a funny story. I think I told it the last class about I was in an EOC once, State Emergency Operations Center, and the IT people apparently didn't like the idea of the generator exercising under load. So the generator would start up like clockwork every month. It would run for the predetermined exercise period. Everything would check out okay, but the transfer switch was never used. Well, when the generator was actually needed, the whole state EOC facility went black because the generator was exercised, but not the transfer switch. Okay, so you look at PBX systems. I mean, in a lot of office buildings, this is maybe not so true now with voice over IP internet telephony, but back in the old days, you had a PBX somewhere. You'd be surprised how many PBXs at EOCs didn't have battery backup or weren't connected to the generator power circuits. Bonding and grounding practices. Digital nodes. Digital nodes are kind of an interesting thing for like packet radio. You'd be surprised how often packet radio nodes go away because they're at a home QTH. Or maybe the husband and wife get in a fight, and the wife goes ahead and throws all the ham radio equipment out on the front lawn, and you expect to have a digital node to use for your packet radio network, and lo and behold, it's not there any longer when you need it. I'm a big fan of building kind of prepackaged digital nodes and putting them at a commercial or government tower somewhere on top of a tall building where you have an agreement. So it's always there. It's not dependent on whether or not one ham pays his electric bill in a particular month. So just some stuff to think about. So mitigation, make sure you train in the core competencies. Being an MCOM volunteer is a little bit like being in the Marine Corps. Marines are riflemen first and foremost. You may have an MOS that's refrigerator repair technician, but you're ultimately expected to be a combat asset. In amateur radio, the fact that you own a two-way radio doesn't make you an emergency communicator. What makes you an emergency coordinator is the fact that you have the communication skills to actually use that radio properly. This means that every ARES or OXCOM group every volunteer has to know and be drilled on basic radio telephone procedures, voice procedures, use the proper code words, use the correct phonetic alphabet, being able to transcribe, transmit, and receive tactical messages as well as record message traffic like radiogram ICS 213 messages. The basic communication skills are the meat and the foundation on which everything else is built. Okay. Hams confuse connectivity with communications. The fact that you can establish connectivity between 2 points now does not mean that you have the capacity to communicate between those 2 points. One's a technical problem. The other one is an operational problem. Yes, it's good that you can establish connectivity. Now we have a circuit. How do we use it? And that usually means that you have to be able to transmit and receive tactical or record message traffic. You have to be able to keep an accurate radio log so you can answer inquiries from officials. You have to be able to do the tasks that are a part of the entire communications process. Getting the messages being drafted, getting them tendered for origination, putting a proper date time group and message serial number on them, all the things you need to be able to track your communications, engage in the administrative tasks and so on. That's part of the communications process as well. Okay, so I'm a big believer that every MCOM volunteer has to have the basic common denominator skills, and that is basically good, solid voice communications abilities. Okay. Another thing you might want to think about on the preparedness level is building teams. For example, you might have a group of individuals that is your EOC team. You might have another a small group or cadre of individuals that are assigned to the National Weather Service office when it's the meteorological office when it's needed. You might have teams that you can deploy to hospitals, and they're kind of trained and integrated into that hospital process, how to interact with the trauma center or the emergency center in a disaster, where they already know the people, they've already talked, and they've already participated maybe in some exercises. You might have a group of specialists. You might have guys that are really into digital. You might have guys that are really into traffic handling. You might have guys that are just really good at solving technical problems. Find out what people's talents are and build teams around them. Don't try and fit a square peg into a round hole. If you, for example, we talked about CW. It's a really useful skill to have, the ability to access a CW traffic net. Now, you might not have any CW operators in your group, but maybe the county next door does. They have the 2 or 3 guys that are really into CW and would be willing to be the people who handle that if it's needed, right? So you can borrow people or build like a mutual assistance arrangement. In the professional world, if you look at fire departments, it's very rare for smaller fire departments to have their own hazmat team. It requires special training, special equipment, special turnout gear, special skills. Well, they don't, it's too expensive for a smaller fire department to have its own hazmat team. So what happens is fire departments build consortiums where you might have 3, 4, or 5 fire departments that have a shared hazmat team. Same thing with like SWAT teams and the like in law enforcement, right? you might have 3 or 4 officers, or 5 or 7 officers from a couple of departments, and they have a single team based on a consortium because it's a special, they're special operators in a way. It's a high level skill. So you can do this in ham radio. Yeah. When it comes to kind of some of these specialized skills, specialized technical knowledge, talk to the counties next to you and say, hey, we really don't have enough guys to do these tasks. Do we build some kind of consortium to accomplish some of these specialized skills that we need, right? Like if you want to deploy mesh networks and or something unique like that, well, then see about mutual aid. In the response phase, you are going to have to plan for limitations. A big one's gasoline. Gasoline is very scarce in a disaster area, particularly if there's a widespread power outage. If the power's out, most gas stations, they may have gas in the ground, but there's no way for them to pump it. Okay. You may find yourself competing with high-profile agencies for whatever gasoline is available. Army National Guard, law enforcement, fire service, Red Cross. Ham radio's pretty low on the totem pole, you know. So keep in mind that, gasoline may be a problem, for in time of emergency. For example, handheld radios, sometimes having some alkaline cell, double A battery packs for your HT is a good idea because you can harvest AA batteries out of pretty much anything, be it transistor radio or, smoke detectors or the kids' toys if you have to. But you can't charge say a NiCad battery pack if you don't have a place to plug in the charger. Foul weather gear, personal protective equipment. If you go into a disaster area to shadow say a search and rescue crew or some type of Red Cross group or something like that, there's all kinds of hazards in a disaster area. There's debris with protruding nails. There's low-hanging cables that can get you in the eye. There's damaged structures that can fall on you. It's a good idea to have that hard hat, the gloves, and some heavy-soled work boots so you don't get a nail through your foot. These are all things to think about in terms of both limitations and vulnerabilities. Again, I touched on mutual aid. In most MCOM groups, you truly have a major disaster, don't have enough people to support it. A good response. It's actually studies have been done and found that basically you lose about 30 or 40% of your volunteers right off the bat because they're either directly impacted by the disaster or their family members have been impacted, and that is going to take priority for them. Or they may have a critical job where they're mobilized. So you should have the ability to bring in mutual aid volunteers from surrounding MCOM groups. And usually they're not that familiar with your area. So having some pre-prepared briefing packets can be really useful, as simple as some municipal and county maps, some pre-identified staging areas. So you got people coming in from, a city, 30 or 40 miles away. Where do we meet? Might be the parking lot at your local Walmart. It might be, behind a particular fire station or sheriff's department facility. You should know where these staging areas are going to be before the disaster. You should, know what kind of housing facilities are available for these people if they have to stay overnight. There's a lot of these things to think about. Prepare some packets with all the information they need about the local area. Where's the hospitals? Where's the schools? If you assign a guy from outside your area to assist, say, local fire service, and you say you need to report to fire station number 23. It's helpful if he has a map that shows him where fire station number 23 is, some pencils, pencil sharpener, just some useful things to have maybe 25 or or 30 of these packets made up. And again, understand that you're going to have to work people in shifts and so on. Talk to your EMA about, vetting these people. What type of ID is acceptable? What type of credentials might volunteers need? Will they have access to gasoline? Maybe from the county pump, and in what quantities? MCOM volunteers should kind of make it a rule to keep their gas tank at least half full. And it doesn't hurt to have a couple of 5-gallon safety cans on hand either, for your response. So some things to think about. And remember, you may not always be the MCOM group of last resort. Commercial infrastructure is getting pretty robust. Government infrastructure is getting pretty robust. But you may be asked to do some other things, right? These what we call the value-added services, helping out with parades, large community events, or just being a supplemental emergency management volunteers during a significant emergency. These are very useful as training opportunities. They're great community service, but also remember that you don't want your organization to morph into just emergency management volunteers who happen to provide free infrastructure and their own radios for use by a government agency. So kind of try and strike a balance between the value-added services and not being used to provide services that really aren't essential in any kind of way, because you can burn your people out doing that. Okay, so we're moving along. We're talking about a lot of stuff here, and as you might have guessed, it's a pretty intensive amount of information here. But one of the really useful exercises you can engage in is just creating some emergency communications guidelines. And I want to stress first and foremost, and this again applies in both the professional and the amateur world, the plan has to be created in a collaborative environment. That is, those that are expected to follow the plan should have input into its development. If a plan is created in a vacuum, absolutely nobody's going to follow it. So you might want to get together with your MCOM group. You can have maybe a working committee. Working committee kind of lays out, a section at a time. They go back to the general membership for their input and ideas and investment, and then they finalize it. And you go on to the next phase of the plan. But obviously, all plans start with the basics, right? Alert and notification, initial coordination functions. What's the initial check-in and deployment net or frequency? What facilities are always staffed in a major disaster? Like your EOC will always be staffed. Then you talk a little bit about how you might respond to each hazard or vulnerability in your community. There's different steps you might take based on the hazard or vulnerability. You define any universal message formats for certain reporting functions. So like if you look at the RRI plan, we have a standard SITREP form. We have a standard weather observation form. We have a standard operational readiness form or format. These are things to think about in the plan. Reference data is really useful. A list of nets, list of repeater frequencies and PL tones, maybe telephone numbers that ring through to EOC message routers or certain served agency facilities to help facilitate message delivery in the event that infrastructure is still operational. Maybe some specific standard operation guidelines for certain specialized functions like weather spotting or other forms of data collection, reading flood gauges at dams, things of that nature. There's a lot there that you can build into an emergency plan, but likewise, don't make it so rigid and so detailed that it stifles our wonderful ability to improvise. In the response phase, you will be layering nets. So we use as an example in the basic radio telephone communications class the concept of a let's say you have a VHF net with 30 operators checked in, okay? And let's further assume that each of these operators has a pile of message traffic, and it's all of roughly the same priority, okay? So if you have 30 guys on a net, that means each of those operators only has 2 minutes out of every hour during which he can transact his business, okay? So in other words, it's easy to think because it's voice communications, for example, they have plenty of circuit capacity, but you don't. So you might want to layer nets based on emergency management function. So for example, you might have a repeater just for volunteers to check in and get an assignment and be told where to report. You might have another repeater or frequency that coordinates the movement of certain emergency vehicles, be it evacuation buses, where you have hams embedded on the bus, or a Salvation Army canteens, whatever the case might be. You might have another repeater that is for that search and rescue function that coordinates the movement of the urban search and rescue groups around your community. You might have another point-to-point circuit, or maybe a UHF repeater, or something that is for the hospitals to intercommunicate. You might have a point-to-point circuits for like an intercom circuit between a couple of incident command posts in the EOC. You can imagine, probably now in your own head how, you want to layer nets, and then you want traffic exchange between these nets. So generally speaking, if I have a net that's just coordinating search and rescue functions, most of the traffic, the vast majority, will simply be communications that's internal to the SAR function. But now and then a message may need to go to the EOC, or may need to go out of state, or it may need to go somewhere else. Well, then that message can be transferred to another net, either through a gateway function, or it can be, the operator holding the traffic can be excused from the net. He can move to a different net, send the traffic, and return. So there's all these kinds of things to think about if you ever really want to seriously respond to the big one, the major disaster, right? And then, of course, consider certain functions that might be appropriate to having some inherent security. So, for example, if you need to send a report about a certain quantity of fatalities, probably best to not to do that on a 2-meter FM net. That would be a good job for, say a CW net, or a VHF single sideband, or something where it's not going to be picked up by the local TV station, right? Ideally, you won't be handling communications traffic, but again, you never know. Again, remember that you're never an island. Even if you have a sizable ARES group, you're going to lose a certain percentage to the disaster impact. You're going to lose a certain percentage of volunteers that work in the utility industry, or public safety, or broadcast, or transit and railroad, whatever the case might be. And then furthermore, the most people can really work, particularly as we get older, is a 12-hour shift. So let's say, for example, I have 100 guys, I've lost 60. That leaves me, 40 operators. And then if I work them in 12-hour shifts, that only gives me 20 operators available at any one time to assist. So have that mutual aid plan and enforce. Again, make wise use of your human resources. Implement the neighborhood ham watch, or radio watch program, as it's sometimes called. Collaborate with local VOADs and SAR groups to train them and develop their ability to communicate efficiently using resources such as GMRS, FRS, CB radio, etc., and then provide a single point of gateway between those groups and the ham thing. That way you only need maybe one guy to facilitate support of maybe 10 or 12 SAR guys, or similar type of group working in the field, be it a faith-based group or a humane service, or whatever the case might be. Same thing for Red Cross. I know Red Cross still uses 47 megahertz, probably in some areas, But if you've got Red Cross vehicles that are already equipped with two-way radio capability, then all you need to do is have a single gateway between their net and the amateur radio service. And finally, don't overlook CB radio. One of the big problems they had during Hurricane Katrina was the fact that all kinds of semi-truck drivers came down to deliver disaster supplies, and there was no way to communicate with them. So the poor guys couldn't figure out where to go or what the best route to the address was. And if you had a high-profile CB radio net set up on channel 19, you could probably communicate with those guys, or at least hopefully anyway. So there are options, and sometimes other radio services that we overlook because in day-to-day times it's not important to us, right? Again, we talked about the use of force multipliers like neighborhood ham watch and the National SOS Radio Network. If you have an SAR team in the field here, or a community group, a humane group or a church group working in a community, in a fairly tight area, they can communicate using other radio services. And then all we need is an operator that's nearby or embedded with them that provides the gateway to the amateur networks, be it the amateur station at the EOC or the 911 center or to an HF gateway, who can basically access WinLink or Mars or RRI. So you create your force multipliers. And finally, I guess as we kind of wrap this up, we want to maximize the use of existing resources, right? So don't try and reinvent the wheel. This is something that ham groups are notorious for doing. So I've been in states where the Aries group has its own net, and yet the state has 4 or 5 very active single sideband traffic nets, NTS type nets, but they nonetheless create an additional net for their use. Whereas I think if they got the net managers together from those 3 or 4 or 5 other nets and said, hey, well, let's work together. You have all this staff, you have all these volunteers. Can we utilize your net instead of trying to invent yet another net with all the overhead of needing net controls and things of this nature? So look to see what infrastructure already exists. And if it's not necessary, don't invent yet more infrastructure. Every net, every system requires volunteers, requires time and energy and things of this nature. If you can use an existing resource within your community, go ahead and take advantage of it. Try and work with them first before you create yet another net. Manpower is scarce and valuable. And, let's face it, there's, I don't know how many hams now in the United States, probably, 400,000 or 500,000, maybe more, but only a small percentage of those are interested in providing MCOM resources. So you have to use your volunteer resources wisely whenever possible. Conduct emergency exercises. We won't spend a lot of time on this, but orientations, or when you get a new volunteer, you have to intake him, you have to introduce them to what his job is, you have to engage in some initial training, get him involved in classes like this, and then you have to exercise your assets. You have to have some drills, exchange some message traffic on weekly Aries nets, utilize some of the RRI tools that are used to train Aries or MCOM members in basic voice communications procedures, conduct the occasional, maybe once or twice a year, tabletop exercise. When your county has, or your city has a functional or full scale emergency or disaster exercise, see if you can play a role in it, okay? So you can figure out how to interface and interact with your served agency. So again, I want to stress brevity is the soul of emergency communications. So one of the mistakes you often see with hams is they're afraid to tell their served agency customers. They're afraid to discuss limitations. So when you interface with your emergency management director or your fire chief or whomever you work with in your MCOM group, you need to explain both the benefits and the limitations of your capabilities in your networks. So, for example, you might explain to your emergency management director that we have a very survivable and very flexible emergency communications capability. It's very easy to improvise. It's very easy to adapt. But in exchange for that, we don't have all of the circuit capacity that you're used to in your day-to-day life with your smartphone and your email. And as a result, we can provide some good, solid, basic communications for you, but we need a degree of brevity and simplicity whenever possible in the communications traffic. So let's talk about, how you can use our nets in a way that recognizes both their benefits and limitations, right? Don't be afraid to argue for your methods and practices. If I pick up the phone and I call Western Union and I say, hey, I want to wire, $500 to my granddaughter in, San Luis Obispo, I don't say, but I want you to use a certain network and a certain message format, and I want to use certain accounting principles. No, I hand them, the $500 at the Western Union store, or whatever the point of contact is, and I rely upon them to manage the whole accounting process and the data transmission process, and theoretically $500 comes out at the other end when she picks it up. We have our own methods and practices based on the nature and characteristics of our networks, our modes, our capabilities. What the emergency management director wants is he wants to know that if he injects a message on one end of your net, it comes out the same way on the other end. But it's good for him to know, for example, a lot of our nets are case insensitive. So, just understand that. We have certain message formats that we use, but it's still everything that you need in terms of accountability data. Be sure to explain the process. Be honest up front. Explain benefits versus limitations. Remind customers of our imperative for interoperability. We should be originating message traffic that can pass between any mode, from digital to voice, from digital to message router and EOC to public safety to a radio voice, from voice to digital, from digital to CW. That's how we leverage our flexibility and our ability to get the message through regardless of the circumstances. So again, recognize also that you can't reinvent the internet or cellular mobile data networks. For example, I don't know how much is invested in cellular mobile data networks in a typical year, but it's probably measured in trillions of dollars for all I know. Worldwide, God knows how much. I mean, ham radio is not going to do that, right? It's not going to happen. So we don't want to live in the past, but likewise, we don't want to try and emulate the capabilities of the internet or cellular mobile data networks. I'll tell you one funny story that illustrates this. There was an MCOM group in, I won't mention where, because, people are still around, but they decided to build their own paging network. Now, this is kind of humorous because I think at the time you could get a basic pager service from RAM or PageNet for incredibly dense, multiple redundant infrastructure that pretty much worked everywhere for like a few dollars a month. But yet these guys got the idea that they got some some low band VHF paging transmitters donated, boxes of pagers, and they were going to build their own paging system. Well, it really didn't make sense, right? Because the cost of commercial paging service, which is far more redundant, far more reliable, etc., was de minimis. Most people can afford a few dollars a month for a pager at the time. So it was kind of silly in a way. They tried to reinvent a commercial product without the financial resources to replicate a commercial product. So be careful sometimes. Ask yourself, is it cost effective and realistic for us to try and reinvent a service that already exists? Some other advice: avoid internal politics and external politics. So the internal, of course, is hams fighting amongst each other. We see this all the time. We see it in Newington. We see it in local groups. I used to have a little fun. We had a field operations workshop that we developed for the state EMA, and I had embedded in that course a slide called the urination theory. So the urination theory works like this. If you take two male dogs and you introduce them to a new territory, they will typically walk around to various objects, be it the fire plugs or the shrubs or the roses you've been so carefully tending, and they will urinate on them. The first dog walks by and he urinates on the shrub and he says, "This is my shrub." And then, of course, the second dog comes by and says, "No way, man, it's my shrub," and he urinates on it. So this is the urination theory. Now, it's intended to be humorous, of course, but if you watch emergency services professionals, you will see this happen all the time. I want to be in charge. My agency takes precedence. I'm going to tell you what to do. It's the SJ power and control thing. I joke that power and control is the ultimate aphrodisiac for most men. You have to make a point usually at some point in your management of not just hams, but any kind of emergency services group. You have to ask yourself, am I interested in mission success, or am I interested in ego and politics? And of course, the honorable and ethical response is, I'm interested in mission success. So try to avoid both internal politics within your group. Try and avoid getting immersed in external politics with your EMA or your served agencies. Stay away from all that stuff. Concentrate on making your programming effective and as professional as possible. Okay. So let's see. I think what we're going to do here is let's escape for a minute. And we still have some things to talk a little bit about how RRI responds. But I think this is a good place to take a little break. And let me stop the share. And let's see if we have any questions, comments, Rotten Tomatoes, or this guy's insane. So any comments, insights, questions so far? Have I put you all to sleep? Tell you a few golf jokes or something of that nature? Okay.
I think we're good, James. Do you have any successful examples of any groups working together with the government organizations?
Oh yeah, there's some very effective, MCOM groups out there. And WinLink's an excellent example at an infrastructure level. They have great relationship with federal government, with shares, FEMA, etc. They're very collaborative, and that's you can learn a lot from the WinLink group. So, for example, if an agency comes to them and we want a specialized form developed, they will accommodate that organization. They're interested in mission success. They take a very mature a professional approach to how they interact with agencies. There's also a fair number of very effective, Oxcom and local groups around the United States. Again, it's kind of interesting. Local MCOM groups are cyclical. They're a little bit like sports teams. If you ever follow professional sports, you'll see that they go through kind of this almost sinusoidal cycle where they have a few years where they have championship level teams, and then they kind of roll off. They perform more poorly over time, and they have horrible seasons, where they go through a drought, and then they begin to rebuild. And I've seen this over the years with local MCOM groups. There's a famous was anyways long deceased, but there was a famous historian named Bruce Catton, and he was an eminent historian of the Civil War, but he wrote a wonderful book about his childhood growing up around the turn of the 20th century. And his father was head of a small educational academy in, let's call it the remote lumbering regions of northern Michigan. And he observed that many smaller organizations, the success or failure of that organization hinges on one man, that driving force behind things. And I've seen this with ham radio groups, right? You have one or two guys that really push hard. They really get things going. They really keep it going. And then something happens where they either tire out, they burn out, or they leave, or they die. And then the organization kind of degrades. So one of the messages there is that if you want the institution to follow and succeed over a long period of time, you should always be training your replacement. You need to be recruiting people and kind of grooming them, you might say, to take these leadership positions, so you can continue to provide the services that you've committed to in your local community. Is that a helpful answer?
Definitely. Appreciate it.
Yeah, you're welcome. Absolutely, Emma. Any other questions, comments, concerns, etc.? Okay, well, I'll continue then and talk a little bit about the overview of RRI, and that should put us in a position to adjourn just about, I guess just about 2 hours. So this will work out okay, I think. So back to share. Let's see. Oh, that didn't work here. There we go. Okay, from current slide. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about RRI. So Radio Relay International, and of course, we're going to assume a little bit that you've attended the TR-002, which is the introduction to the RRI traffic system. But if you did, you'll recognize the fact that RRI generally has two network configurations. We have what we call our routine configuration, and this is our just daily, day-to-day operation of time sequence nets and the 24-hour-a-day automated, processes of both digital traffic net and the WinLink to RRI gateway process. And it's assumed under a routine configuration that all traffic is either routine or of the fast telegram precedence. There's no need for special nets. There's no need for specialized point-to-point circuits, no need for gateways. Everything's pretty much a sequential operation, largely predicated on the old national traffic system as it was originally structured. It's a training opportunity. It's a public relations opportunity. It keeps kind of a network infrastructure in place. Now, obviously, the routine net configuration will not work in major disaster. So in our national response plan, we have the capacity to move into what's called an emergency operations phase. And this is where we might activate some nets on a 24-hour basis. We might set up special point-to-point circuits to support a certain agency or to expedite the flow of traffic, from out of a disaster area. We might increase the connect and download frequency for digital traffic stations, things of this nature. This is the emergency configuration. And so our national response plan basically is such that we will typically issue a mode or frequency matrix. This is sometimes called an ICS 205, where we will identify what frequencies and what nets and agencies might be supported, or what the purposes of the nets are. We might identify a specific state or section as the target for message routing and delivery to certain served agencies. We typically will appoint a network management coordinator. The network management coordinator is really a data collecting person. Essentially, each person active on RRI is asked to originate what's called an operational readiness message. The operational readiness message will state essentially what nets he has access to, what served agencies he has access to, what his hours of operation might be, and any limitations that he has or any special requirements. So this, for example, allows the network management coordinator to essentially create a searchable spreadsheet through which you can look for, who's active in what states, what municipalities, etc. So, for example, if FEMA comes to you, or an agency or NGO, and they say, do you have connectivity to Glens Ferry, Idaho? You can say, yes, we have somebody there. It's accessible through this net. Well, here's a message. Please send it to them. Well, that tells us how to route that message, right? So the operational readiness message format's defined in the National Response Plan. And in an emergency, we would have a target station, or in other words, a target operator or two, whose job it is to collect those op-red reports, populate the modified ICS 205, and share that information with whomever requires it to facilitate an effective communications plan, and give us the ability to answer those kinds of inquiries. Okay, we may say, for example, that digital traffic stations and WinLink liaison stations should connect to their assigned node every 15 minutes or every half hour or every hour, based on the nature and type of emergency, the type of communications traffic being originated. We might ask operators to submit situation reports or respond to what's called RRIs, requests for information. For example, we might be interested in what highways are closed or obstructed, or what type of infrastructure is inoperative, what's the extent of widespread power outages. These were things that we might request information for in the form of a SIT-rep. So we have a standard format for SIT-reps. We might ask operators to submit weather data, for example, during tropical storms or major ice storms or blizzards or things of this nature. So these types of standard formats are defined in the National Response Plan. Okay, again, recognizing the fact that we're primarily an infrastructure provider, we will utilize our manual mode net structure to facilitate some of these special functions. So, for example, special routings, point-to-point circuits, such as during Cascadia Rising, where we had what are called priority entry points, where messages going to the National Response Coordination Center in Washington, D.C. could be injected on certain watch frequencies and then rapidly transferred across the country and injected into the data stream at the NRCC. So you might have watch frequencies assigned. You might have point-to-point circuits to expedite flow of traffic across country if it's requested. These are all things that we can do to respond not just organically to unpredictable communications problems, but to have a process in place to support a unified infrastructure response. So we're going to move from this kind of historic time sequence schedule of nets and cycles, where local nets and region nets and area nets meet in a kind of a time sequence through over a period of several hours to a point where what we're actually doing is we're repurposing like this inter-area traffic net here into priority entry point functions and point-to-point circuits for priority or emergency traffic or maybe even welfare traffic. And likewise, where we're utilizing the WinLink RRI gateways and DTN to provide kind of an automatic transfer, traffic transfer and routing across the country. So the nice thing about this is it's scalable, right? We can just activate, region or area nets. We can activate the priority entry point function. We can establish point-to-point circuits. We can identify target stations for sit reps or weather observations. We can basically, through some very simple operating directives, reconfigure the entire traffic system to support a major disaster. And we can use, the digital traffic net with this access through Vera and Pactor. We are now building up an NBEMS priority entry point program. We will have a CW priority entry point program that's already in place. And then, of course, we'll have our WinLink RRI gateways, in addition to our own, digital traffic station functions from these state nets or section nets to RRI. So the idea here is to have a very scalable and flexible network infrastructure that can respond dynamically to any type of disaster. And we've tested this and it works really very well. So, DTN again runs 24/7 already. It already does automatic forwarding of traffic as soon as it's uploaded. But we can go ahead and assign our sysops to ensure, number one, monitor nodes to make sure that they're operating correctly and efficiently. And we can, the liaison process between state and local nets and DTN, that connect and download frequency can be increased or decreased based on the scope of the disaster. We can use certain stations with directional antennas and amplifiers to target a disaster area. This worked very good in several exercises that we've done. We can, if you want to, you can even build a VHF or UHF gateway to RRI at the local level. So this is the Cascadia Rising network topology. It's pretty straightforward. What we did is we established multiple watch frequencies, both voice CW and digital, and of course, basically these watch frequencies were staffed by qualified operators who would receive the message traffic and then transmit it across country to the eastern Pennsylvania section, adjacent, real close to Washington, D.C., where it would be injected into the NRCC via the Web EOC program. The idea here being that in a major disaster in the Pacific Northwest, the internet would be inoperative in these areas, but obviously it would still be functioning over here. Same thing with the digital traffic net. We had basically all the incoming traffic addressed to the NRCC was addressed to specific target stations in the EPA section, and they also injected their traffic independently into Web EOC, where it was consolidated and went into the data stream at the National Response Coordination Center. So very simple process, but again, kind of ironically, the CW net in some respects outperformed the digital net, which was kind of a shock, and maybe that's one of the reasons the ARRL had such an overwrought response to to the exercise. I'm not really sure. Again, we cover, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this because we cover it in TR-002. But again, if you look here, the digital traffic net is fully automated 24/7 under both routine and emergency conditions. The the main thing that has to change in emergency conditions is that we have to, again, the region hubs serve the state nets. And so you have to make sure that the digital traffic stations are connecting at the right frequency to expedite the download and last mile routing of the traffic in a timely manner. So that's the only thing that really changes is how we manage the DTS function for traffic either leaving a state or coming into a state via the digital traffic station function. And of course, that would be specified in operational bulletins. The WinLink RRI gateways work on a similar principle. There's a gateway for each region. So if you originate, say, for example, a radiogram ICS 213 message, you upload it using the WinLink templates. It will be automatically routed to its destination region. Under routine conditions, that operator may only connect once or twice a day. Under emergency communications, he may connect there may be several operators assigned theoretically, and they would connect every 15 minutes or every half hour each, and you'd be constantly ensuring that you had timely routing and delivery of that traffic. We exercise this arrangement with both Army Mars and a U.S. Navy medical system exercise, and it had excellent results. Very, very positive feedback on network performance. And again, this is this brings me back to the example of WinLink. The WinLink development team has been great at collaborating with RRI. And we greatly appreciate that, because we shouldn't be competing amongst each other as hams, okay? We should be collaborating and looking for symbiotic solutions to communications problems. If you're say a major national organization, be it the Wireless Institute of Australia or Radio Society of Great Britain or the American Radio Relay League, the general policy should be not to say we're going to run the show. The general policy would be, let's find ways we can facilitate the success of all the various interests within our constituencies. And in the MCOM world, again, you look at WinLink, we don't want to reinvent WinLink. I don't think WinLink wants to reinvent what we do, but there's an overlap and there's ways in which we can collaborate. And the WinLink development team guys have really been top flight professionals in terms of how they deal with that. That's our goal, is we want to provide a professional, high grade, quality MCOM program. We don't want to go into your community and tell you how to run your local MCOM program. We just want to give you a good infrastructure that provides reliable service. And that's what the NRP, National Response Plan, does. It's there to allow us to adapt and dynamically respond to disaster situations to effectively support local MCOM. And so I think all of us here know what a DTS is. And this is essentially a properly trained and whitelisted radio operator with either VERA or a Pactor 1, 2, 3, or 4 that is authorized to serve as a digital traffic station. The digital traffic station is the liaison point between a local and or state networks and the digital traffic network. And he ideally is not just one, but there should be several DTS operators in each state. And again, they're a key component in making those determinations of what's the best method to achieve last mile connectivity. It might be another digital mode. It might be a voice mode. It might be a CW mode. He has the liberty to make the best resource management decision to get that traffic rapidly to its destination when it's necessary to do so. And a DTS can be associated with an local MCOM group, a state or local traffic net, an agency, or a response team of some kind. Okay, And ideally, we would like 3 digital traffic stations minimum in each state. Same with the WinLink liaison gateway operators. Okay, you always want some redundancy for these critical choke point functions. We again are developing in, let's call it an NBEMS team. It's a team of let's call it diverse digitally equipped operators that can staff watch frequencies in time of emergency, so that, for example, if you have a hurricane in the Caribbean, people can simply call one of these stations on a watch frequency and send messages, particularly those that aren't equipped for DTS. It'll work the same as our priority entry point for voice or CW. Again, this allows us to take different modes and then kind of convert them into the standard process to facilitate a universal infrastructure function. So again, to activate the plan, you have to notify the RRI emergency manager or one of the area chairmen that's on the board of directors, and we can activate the plan, issue the necessary directives. There is an activation request message format in the National Response Plan, and you simply transmit that message via whatever means you have available, and we will activate the program for you. If it's something really big, let's call it a big disaster, everybody's obviously going to be activated for, we can self-activate as well. If you want to use RRI in an exercise, we recommend that you give us at least 2 weeks notice so we can issue the appropriate directives and so forth, in advance of your exercise, so that our staff can support you in a realistic manner. So if you're going to do a major, like full-scale exercise or functional exercise, where you're originating quantities of message traffic for locations outside your area, please try and give us a bit of notice so that we're prepared to, operate for the duration of the exercise and emergency configuration. I see this needs to be updated. Forgot to do that. Joe Ames has passed away, but this number, of course, is still valid here. So the email now is radiorelay.org, no dash, where we changed our URL a couple years ago. So here's my 10 points to take away at the end of our 2-hour session. I'm getting pretty good at this. It's a 1 hour, 59 minutes. So priorities in order of importance: survivability, flexibility, circuit capacity, and then security. Okay. Individual MCOM volunteers have to be trained, and they have to drill handling record message traffic and utilizing those basic radio telephone net procedures that are essential to an effective voice net or tactical net. It's just like a soldier knowing how to march or to use his rifle, okay, and how not to get killed. All volunteers need to have that baseline set of communication skills. Later on, they can specialize, okay, but the common denominator modes are the foundation of MCOM response, okay. Plan for personnel loss, develop mutual aid, make sure that, if you have a major disaster and a lot of your local volunteers are unavailable, that you can supplement your organization with mutual aid volunteers from surrounding areas, and they too should be properly trained in the basics, right? They don't have to be experts, but they need to know the basic common denominator stuff, which is basically voice communications. Apply the emergency management cycle, mitigation, harden critical systems, preparations, train, plan, exercise, drill, okay? Response, remember, you should layer nets. You need to manage circuit capacity wisely. You need to engage in emergency communications resource management decisions intelligently. look at the characteristics of the modes you might apply to the various emergency management functions, and use the mode that's best suited to the function being supported. Whenever possible, use your staff wisely. Use force multipliers, such as GMRS radio, FRS radios, single point shadowing. Don't overlook other methods and capabilities. And lastly, when you engage in an exercise or you engage in an actual disaster operation, be sure to debrief, be sure to assess, and be sure to correct problems. Okay, keep what works and modify or improve what doesn't. Okay, so those are my 10 big points here to take away from this course if you forget everything else. So that's my opinion, and I hope that everybody takes it to heart. With that, I am going to stop sharing, and we will go to any questions, discussion, or thoughts on what we've discussed or I've talked about over the last 2 hours. So it's your turn to offer your insights.
Hi, James. This is Carmen.
Hi, Carmen.
I just enjoyed everything you did. I just reviewed some points. I think I'm going to be getting ready. So thank you for your job and for your dog barking. I love it.
Yeah. I couldn't get away from that one. Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you.
Big old Chesapeake Bay Retriever upstairs. Yeah, he had to let himself be heard.
Thank you.
Thanks, Carmen. Yep, see you soon. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Okay, any other comments, questions?
James, can you... Sorry, somebody's microphone's still on.
Yeah. Mute your mics if you got a radio or something going in the background.
James, can you elaborate more on the NBEMS gateways and what mode they will actually use?
Well, we're working on that right now. We haven't quite finalized that. We've solicited the volunteers, so we got a pretty good cadre of volunteers. So typically, how we had handled the what we call priority entry point process in the past was a CW invoice. But obviously CW operators are hard to get a hold of. A lot of state sections and individuals can't use that. Single sideband is okay, but it's sometimes it's nice to have a digital mode instead, particularly for poor propagation conditions or where you require a more narrow bandwidth mode. So there's some discussion as to what we're going to use. And we hope to make a determination here pretty soon on exactly what, maybe a primary, secondary, and tertiary mode, for the NBEMS process. But this would allow, like an Aries group to access a priority entry point with modes that are in already pretty common use in the amateur community.
Okay, thanks.
I'm sorry I don't have a more specific answer for you at the moment. Other questions, comments? Okay.
I have a question.
Oh, yeah, go ahead. Yep.
Jim Scott Walker N3SW.
Yeah.
On the chart that needed updating there, is there a backup POC to you in case of needing an activation?
Yeah, any of the area coordinators. So, for example, in your area would be Jim Kutch, and another backup would be on the Emergency Communications Committee. We have Steve Hansen up in Maine, and also on the any of the MCON committee members. So Charles Hargrove, who's the head of New York City Amateur Radio Emergency Communication Services. You can get a hold of any of those people in the eastern area.
Okay, thanks.
I see N3XUS. Gene, you have your hand up. Go ahead, sir.
Yes. Good afternoon, everybody on the net. This is Gene, November 3 X-ray Uniform Series, coming from glorious Killeen, Texas, where Fort Hood is at. My question is this, well, this is a scenario. I'm also a member of the Texas Races Network. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, yeah.
And the state has issued out go kits to the regional and some district radio operators. And they're pretty much standardized. They're one piece or two piece basic cases. They come from VHF, UHF, digital, WinLink, capabilities, laptops, everything. Is there for the RRI a recommended minimal amount of equipment that should be in an individual operator's go kit, and that to include a portable power supply like a battery and antenna selections?
We don't have a standard for that. We do have the course, portable emergency communications, where we do talk about some of these issues, but we don't have a specific standard of, like, for example, what modes every volunteer should have and so forth. And there's some reasons for that. Everybody has different economic situations. Everybody has, different interests and so forth. But the course entitled Portable Emergency Communications, we do talk about what we consider, some of the considerations for field deployment and antennas and things of this nature. But we haven't gone as far to do that, and I'm not sure we're going to. I think it's I get it. The government had to create a standard, right, so they could disseminate these. We're in kind of a different situation. We're for us to try and do something like that, I think would be like trying to herd cats. For your state EMA, it's a little bit different because they have, let's call it the magisterium, to do so. And they also obviously have to have a standard in order to do procurement and accountability and everything that goes with distributing those. So right now, there's no plans to do that, Gene. Go ahead.
Okay, do you can you give a reference to what you mentioned about a suggested equipment package? You just mentioned a few minutes ago when it comes to, I guess, the portable communications kits or equipment.
Yeah, so have you attended the training class Portable Emergency Communications yet?
No, not as yet.
Okay, it's available on YouTube. And I will send you a link. I'll send a link out after the class today.
Oh, I appreciate that very much. Everybody have a great day. Enjoy the weekend.
Yeah, thank you. You too, Gene. Appreciate it. Other questions, comments? I should probably look at the chat. Let's see.
James, this is W9TAX.
Yeah, go ahead.
Was RRI engaged in the North Carolina Hurricane Helene disaster at all?
I think the only area where we were really engaged at all is, I don't know if are you familiar with the I Am Safe program?
I am not.
Okay. So it'd be worth looking it up on our webpage. So we developed, and again, this is kind of a joint project we've been working on with OneLink, but it was a program that we developed. Well, we did. I mean, the whole group involves Seattle Hubs, Oxcom, and the Western Washington section of the ARRL, their ARIES, the Red Cross, etc. But we do have and it would take some time to describe it, but essentially it's a process for managing health and welfare traffic. So what it is in the I Am Safe program, message centers are deployed within a disaster area. This is done by a local MCOM group or CERT organization. And then based on the message and the amount of information that the individual has, that message will either go out as a welfare message will either go out as a WinLink email, a radiogram, or a text message. Okay, I should say a text message via WinLink. But we have developed a system the person who wants to send the welfare, originate the welfare message, does not have to know the recipient's carrier. It's an automatic digital process that will automatically do that as part of a welfare messaging process. And that was used during the North Carolina event. We need to have a course on that. The guys that developed it, I chair the Emergency Communications Committee, but the real brains behind that process was Damon Liebert and Steve Hansen. But basically, it's designed to automatically route through DTN or the traffic system or WinLink. It's designed to automatically route traffic and deliver it to the addressee as a text message. All we need is a phone number. We don't need to know the carrier or any of that kind of information. So that was utilized, but in terms of North Carolina, I don't have a lot of data on any of the local activities. Let's put it that way.
Right. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, it will be interesting to see what we ultimately hear about how the role amateur radio played, as in totality. I'm curious to know more about that eventually.
Yeah.
So
Thanks.
I think there's a lesson we're learning, by the way, and I think that we put so much emphasis on government agencies and working through government agencies that we are losing sight maybe of the fact that they don't always respond quickly. So, for example, I've been telling hams, I think we need to look at groups like the Cajun Navy as maybe a future, not necessarily a replacement for playing in the sandbox with FEMA and EMAs, but maybe as a parallel approach for these situations where during that first, 3 to 5 days, after a really major disaster, we can deploy some assets in a meaningful way like the Cajun Navy does and begin to provide that messaging early on after a major disaster. And I think it's something that we're going to need to look at.
Or maybe just work with them. They already seem to have it set up. So
Right, and that's again, it goes back to the symbiotic relationships, right? We should always be looking for ways to collaborate rather than trying to do everything independently. So,
all right, thank you.
yep.
This has been a fantastic session. The time did go by fast. I got a lot of information. I was taking some notes here, and I'll be doing some further looking up on some stuff, and I look forward to future sessions as a relatively new member of RRI. Thank you.
Thank you, Gene. Appreciate that. Well, if there's somebody asked here, yes, I'll share the recording. That's not a problem, Jay. So I'll put it on Facebook and distribute notification via our RRI mailing list and our email reflectors that it's been posted. The I am safe messages cannot be sent via Facebook. The system is designed to essentially send a text right to the recipient's cell phone. So I wouldn't even know how to navigate into the swirling waters of the Facebook, bureaucracy. So. Okay, well, I think that takes care of, by the way, Gene, I see Gene mentioned there are 700,000 plus ham ops in the United States, which is kind of interesting. And of course, Greg, you mentioned that encryption is only prohibited on international links and within the terms of your amateur's license. Is permitted in the UK for emergency use and has value and personal data is permitted. It's not permitted here, but yeah, it's good information. As far as 700,000 hams, I think a lot of the new hams are preppers and community service volunteers here in the States. And interestingly, we're having a difficulty integrating the prepper and the community resource groups into our local radio clubs and ARIES programs, which is something we need to talk about as a broad ham radio community in the United States. So we can talk about that some other time. So, gentlemen, thank you so much for being here. I greatly appreciate it, and we'll talk again at a future training class. 73 to everybody.
73, Mr. Wade.
Oh, thank you for being here. Yeah, appreciate it, Louis. Take care.
Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye. See
73s,
ya.
good night.
Take care.